Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome inside the Guilty as Charged podcast. My name is Steven, and I am your host. Little lucky today, get to announce some breaking news and talk about it as the Chargers have signed Mr. Morgan Fox, defensive lineman, formerly of the Panthers and, of course, the Rams. So Tyler and Alex usually get to do these because I work at a charter school as a school counselor, and fortunately had the day off today and work from home usually on Wednesdays. So anyways, get to talk about some breaking news here really quickly. Only going to be, a short video, but wanted to talk about the addition that Morgan Fox is going to bring to this Chargers team. Again, another very solid depth signing after the free agency and draft periods have come and gone. So that being said, let's dive into it. So, a little quick background on Morgan Fox. Signed with the Rams as an undrafted free agent out of Colorado State Pueblo. I forgot a word there. That's my mistake. But that's a Division II school in Colorado. Signed out of there in 2016. In college, he was the record holder for sacks in a single season, 17, and career 36. So he was mostly a practice squad player in 26 as he kind of made that adjustment. Very similar archetype to a Joe Gaziano, if you will, that the Chargers have kind of taken as an edge rusher in college, bumped him inside, and kind of worked with him a little bit, although Fox much more successful at this point. So Morgan Fox was a rotational player after signing his new undrafted free agent contract. In 2017 and 2018, he tore his ACL, unfortunately missing that Super Bowl run for them. And then bounced back as a rotational player in 2019. In those two seasons, 17 and 19, he totaled 34 pressures and 6 sacks, which is pretty solid. And then he re-signed a 1-year tender deal to play under Brandon Staley, of course, and had a breakout season in which he totaled 33 pressures and 7 sacks. Really, really good season. Earned himself a nice payday that the Rams simply could not afford. And so he signed with the Panthers as kind of more of an edge rusher defensive lineman, whereas with the Rams it's kind of the other way around, which we'll get into in a second. Kind of regressed a little bit with the Panthers, had 26 pressures and 3 sacks. As we tweeted out, he's basically best friends with Sebastian Joseph Day. Shout out to Sebastian for breaking some free agency news again. Really wish we could have some conversations with him and how he's recruiting. I don't know. Maybe Sebastian knows a right tackle, which would be very helpful right now. All right. So that being said, that is Fox's kind of profile, if you will. I think he was very successful in the Brandon Staley defense, and who can blame him for wanting to get back in there in that same system? Of course, getting back to Los Angeles, getting back to playing with Sebastian Joseph Day, Troy Reeder, who of course he is familiar with. So those are the former Rams that the Chargers have kind of accumulated. We kind of figured that the Chargers would get him last year. He was somebody that we heard that they were pretty interested in. Heard that they were interested in again this year, of course. And of course, it ended up taking a few months, but finally signing with the Los Angeles Chargers. All right, that being said, we'll move on to the next one in terms of his projecting his role. I've seen a lot of people call him an edge rusher. He's not an edge rusher. He's more of an interior defensive lineman. That's how the Chargers announced him. So when we are talking about Morgan Fox, he's not going to, excuse me as I hit my microphone, he's not going to provide like competition for Kyle Van Noy or for Chris Rumpf. He's an interior rusher who can occasionally kick outside. So if you break down his 2020 snap counts, he has 29 snaps from the A gap, which of course is in front of the center or next to the center. 191 from the B gap, which is kind of your 3 technique role, if you will, in between the guards and the tackles. And then the C gap, which is ahead in front of the tackle or right next to it, if you will. That's kind of the 4I 5 tech that you'll hear as well, as we kind of talk about. So you can call them very different things, right? If you're talking purely gaps, A is between the center and guard, B is between the guard and the tackle, and then C is tackle and tight end. And then anything outside is kind of like your wide 9 we hear. And then from a defensive tackle standpoint, you'll hear nose tackle, you'll hear 1 tech, 3 tech, 4 tech, 5 tech, and then, like I said, wide 9. So as you can see, when he was with the Rams, he was mostly an interior guy who could kick out to the outside. And that's very similar to what the Chargers have in Jerry Tillery. If you look at Jerry Tillery's snap count, which is 850 total snaps, which is absolutely fucking bonkers, man. It just like blows my mind every time I look at Jerry Tillery's snap count from last season. But if you break it down, there's a little bit of snaps against the A gap from designer looks, and there's a few from outside on the edge, again from designer looks. But the bulk of Jerry Tillery snaps come lining up against the guards and tackles as an interior rusher. As you can see there, 352 in the B gap and 373 in the C gap, which again is way too many. So basically, if you're looking at Fox's projected role here, he's going to, for me, in my opinion, he's going to provide legitimate competition for that Jerry Tillery role. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, I would be shocked if they cut Jerry Tillery. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I'm saying is that now finally they have somebody that they trust to take some of those snaps away from Jerry Tillery. And ideally have more snaps than Jerry Tillery, because I do think that Morgan Fox is a more productive player. So, when we were talking about the draft, we were, on our show, we kind of projected them taking a player like Oyema Owuzurike or a Matthew Butler kind of player, because we felt like they needed another pass rushing 4-tech, 5-tech, 3-tech to kind of go along with Jerry Tillery. And then you have all the run defenders that they have. Well, instead, they draft Otito Ogbonya. And so that pass rushing role was kind of like, okay, is that Ogbonya? Is that Christian Covington? Is that Austin Johnson? Now you clearly have, in my opinion, your roles established, with Tillery and Fox kind of being those pass rushers who can play 3-tech, 5-tech, 4-tech, and occasionally kick outside on designer looks. I should have included this picture here, but there are a few plays where the Chargers would put, from last year, there were a few times the Chargers would put Bosa and Nwosu on the same side, have a linebacker blitzing up the middle, or a Justin Jones type. And then on the opposite edge is when you would put a Jerry Tillery or a Christian Covington. So they mess with that kind of designer look, right? You essentially have a 3-by-1 with your 3 best pass rushers on one side, ideally the right side of the offensive line, the weaker side of the offensive line, and then you put Jerry Tillery against the left tackle. So now you can mix and match there. You can put Morgan Fox in that role on the same 3, or you can put Morgan Fox on the opposite side. So again, this just gives them more options, similar to how Kyle Van Noy does. But I do think that he, meaning Morgan Fox, is that kind of pass rushing defensive tackle, defensive lineman that the Chargers needed. So that's where I think we can project his roster role. I would be pretty surprised if they signed him and then cut him. I do think that you can kind of pencil in Morgan Fox as a lock to make the roster. He and Jerry Tillery ideally boosting the interior defensive line depth. And I think, again, having a legitimate rotation there, and some of Jerry Tillery's snap counts being that high is the absence of Justin Jones. They just didn't have another pass rushing defensive lineman they trusted. And now, ideally, Tillery's number comes down to 600, and you get 400 snaps from Morgan Fox in that role. So again, some balance there. Other roster ramifications, I think this basically ensures that Joe Gaziano will not be in consideration. I think we'll see him play, of course, audition for the practice squad, maybe for some other teams. But I would be very surprised if Joe Gaziano would makes this roster, essentially because of Morgan Fox. With the existing defensive line room from yesterday, maybe there's a chance that Joe Gaziano shows off his pass rushing ability and how he's improved, and maybe he convinces them to be that 6th defensive tackle. Maybe he earns a larger role, but that is obviously not going to happen now. That's going to be Morgan Fox's role. And unfortunately, I do think that this could push Braden Fehoko off the roster. I think for my money, I would rather have Braden Fehoko than Christian Covington. But I think if you're looking at kind of the defined roles, you look at Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, and Jerry Tillery as kind of your 3 starters. And Otito Ogbonya is going to make it like they just drafted him. They're not going to cut him. So there's 4. Morgan Fox is 5. So basically, if you carry 6 defensive tackles, you have 1 spot remaining, and that's going to come down to Fehoko or Christian Covington. Now, I would keep Braden Fehoko. I think he's a far superior run defender. His run stop percentage in the back half of the season was like 3rd in the league among all interior defensive linemen at like 16.1, I think is the number. Just a far more productive and disruptive player against the run. He doesn't give you the same kind of flexibility because I think Christian Covington can play the nose. I think he can play the 3 tech. I think he can play the 4 tech and occasionally the 5 tech. Him and Austin Johnson very similar in that regard. But I would much rather have Braden Fehoko and his ability to stop the run. So we'll see. I think if you kind of listen to the way Brandon Staley has talked about those 2 players, he always kind of put Braden Fehoko in kind of that young player. He's learning, he's growing. And Christian Covington was, the solid veteran and the player who kind of carved a really nice role. And he helped us so much because our defensive line depth was shit in training camp, and then we signed him, or in mini camp, I should say. So I think just based off of the way that they talked about him, I mean, they chose Covington initially over Fehoko, if you kind of want to view it that way too. So I do ultimately and unfortunately expect Braden Fehoko gets cut. But I think if you're looking at this Chargers defensive line room and how far it's come, with your top 4, if you will, Morgan Fox, I think would be your 4th. I think you feel really good about that group. Christian Covington as your 5th, and then Otito Obonya as your 6th defensive lineman. So I think that's a really solid group. I think you have, if you want to consider Linval Joseph and Justin Jones a wash for Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson, I think that's fair to say. But I think you unequivocally have an improvement in Morgan Fox for that 4th role. And then Covington, who really should be a 5 or a 6, gets to play that role again. So I think theoretically, like, Covington should be better because there was, again, that stretch of the season when Justin Jones was hurt, that he was also playing a ton of snaps and really unfairly playing those snaps. So I think he's a crafty player who could potentially bring some value. I would rather have Fehoko, but I do expect it to be Covington. So, again, this is a good signing, by Brandon Staley. Checks another box off the needs list that wasn't necessarily a huge pressing need, but he will come in, provide some competition, like I said, for snaps for Jerry Tillery, provide some pass rush boost. He knows the scheme. He can kind of help the younger guys along with Sebastian Joseph Day, of course. And I think the Chargers pass rush is drastically improved from last year. So I have a bit of a deep dive project in the works, which is the project that I talked about last night when I was like, if Morgan Fox could sign tomorrow, that'd be great. And he did. He signed before I recorded that project. So shout out to Morgan Fox and his agent. That project will be available for Patreon and YouTube members only. So please go sign up for those. And, we'll see. Maybe I'll put it public after a little while, but that's going to be specifically for our members and Patreon supporters. So please go check that out. You should be able to add a membership, if you will, just right here after the video. So let me know what you guys think. Morgan Fox officially a Charger. Are you surprised? Are you happy? Are you annoyed? What do you think about that 5th, 6th roster spot in terms of the defensive tackles? Should it be Fehoko? Should it be Gaziano? Or Christian Covington? Should he keep that role? So let me know any of those thoughts, and we will have some deeper thoughts about Morgan Fox on tomorrow's show. So please stay tuned for that one. And bolt up. We'll see you next time.